Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge. Welcome to this follow-up video on the Moog Voyager. What I want to do in this video is get into quite a lot of detail, I have to say, into some very specific stuff about this synthesizer. Now, I thought before I bought a Voyager that I would know pretty much everything there is to know about it. It looked like a fairly straightforward synthesizer to me, but it's only since I've actually bought one that I realize how deep it really is, especially in the modulation department. Now, what I'm going to show you in this video is going to be mainly demonstrated on my Excel that you can see behind me here, but everything I'm going to talk about is equally applicable to any regular Voyager keyboard, or even a very special looking one. So just to warn you, what I'm going to go into here is a lot of detail. It's going to be hardly any playing of the synth at all, but if the modulation capabilities of the Voyager are of interest to you, then in the infamous words of Paul Thompson, let's get stuck in. Okay, so I'm going to assume for this video that you don't own a Voyager yourself. So let's just cover a few basics about modulation. Now, modulation in a synthesizer, any synthesizer, works in a very, very similar way. We have three basic components. We have a modulation source, so for example, an LFO. We have a modulation destination, for example, filter cutoff frequency, and we have a modulation amount, the amount by which we want the source to modulate the destination. Very, very straightforward. Now, in an analog synthesizer, like the Voyager, for example, the modulation amount is basically just an attenuator. Turn it to maximum, and all the modulation signal from the source reaches the destination. Turn it to minimum, and no modulation signal at all gets through. Now, on any serious enthusiast or professional synthesizer, you'll find that there's normally a fourth component in the modulation signal chain, a controller. Now, the most common control of all is, of course, the mod wheel, but any performance control can be a controller in your modulation signal path, such as keyboard velocity or aftertouch. Controllers act exactly like that modulation amount attenuator I mentioned already. You use the controller and the amount together to create the sort of maximum modulation effect that you want. So typically, you would turn your mod wheel up to max, you'd set the amount of modulation to give the effect that you desire, and now, by using the mod wheel on its own, you can bring that modulation effect in or out as you want and add expression to your sounds. Okay, so we've covered the basics of a modulation signal routing. Now let's turn our attention to the Voyager. You'll see here on the front panel two modulation buses. Each one is a separate modulation signal routing, the same as the one we've just described in principle. We have here a control dial to select the modulation source, another one to select a modulation destination, and at the bottom here you can see we have an attenuator to control the modulation amount. But we also have another dial, which Bob Moog labeled shaping. And this is how we can select a controller for the modulation. We'll go into all the choices for these various dials a little bit later on. But there's something extra about these modulation buses. You'll see how they're labeled. One is called mod wheel, and the other one is called pedal/on. Now let's talk about the mod wheel bus first. This bus, as well as having shapers, has the mod wheel as a controller. It's hardwired that way. Now, on the face of it, that might sound a bit limiting, but actually it's the opposite, because what we have here with this bus is two controllers in the signal chain rather than just the usual one. So, for example, we could have the LFO modulate the filter cutoff, and we could set the shaper to, say, keyboard velocity. So as you can hear here, the harder I hit the keys, the stronger the modulation effect. But there might be times when you want to take control of that effect manually, maybe mute it for specific passages you're playing. Well, that's where I can use the mod wheel. It's actually a really powerful and expressive setup. The second bus is called pedal/on. Instead of being hardwired to the mod wheel, this bus is hardwired to a control voltage input. which you'll find on the top of the synth if you have a regular Voyager, and for an Excel like this one, it's on the front panel. It's called Mod 1. There is actually a Mod 2. We'll talk about that one in a minute. Now, the general idea with this Mod 1 CV input is that you'd plug into here a foot pedal and use it a bit like a mod wheel. But you can also plug into it say a foot switch for immediate on-off control of your modulation, and you could plug actually anything in here that provides a control voltage or acts as an attenuator. It's actually immensely flexible. So far, so good. I hope you can see here how comprehensive the modulation is with the Voyager's 2 mod buses. But to be honest, we haven't even got started yet. Okay, so let's take a look at the choices we have on these different modulation dials, and let's look at the modulation sources to start off with. You'll see there 2 waveforms. Those waveforms are choices from the built-in LFO on the Voyager. Then we've got oscillator 3, so we can choose its audio output as a modulation source. Then we have sample and hold. There is a sample and hold circuit built into the Voyager. And then we have something called on/mod 2 and something else called noise/program. Now, with those last two, where you have a choice of 2 things, the first thing that's mentioned there is like a default value. But really, it's all about that second thing. The second thing there is mod 2 and program. Let's talk about those. Let's talk about mod 2 first. Now, mod 2, like mod 1, is a control voltage input. If you don't plug anything into it, then it's on. So it's like having a constant positive voltage as a modulation source, which you could then attenuate if you want to. As for this noise/program option, well, by default, that is noise. But program means it's a programmable source, and we have to go to the Voyager's menu system to choose what we want. So let's take a look at the choices that we've got here. The first one is noise, so that's the default choice. But we also have filter envelope, amplitude envelope, smoothed sample and hold circuit. We have VCO1 and VCO2, so that's the outputs from VCOs number 1 and VCO number 2. And then we have the touch surface, which we haven't talked about yet. We have X and Y, and X and Y relate to the coordinates, basically, of where you're touching the control surface. So in total there, we've got 8 separate programmable modulation sources to add to the ones that we have on the dial. That's an awful lot of modulation sources there available to us. Now, it's a similar story with the Modulation Bus Destinations. On this dial, we have got a choice of pitch, and that's the master pitch. It affects all the oscillators together. Or we can choose VCO2 pitch, so we're just affecting the pitch of VCO2 on its own. Then we have VCO3 pitch, filter cutoff, wave shape. Unfortunately, wave shape is affecting all the oscillators together. And then we have something called LFO rate/program. So again, LFO rate is the default value, but it's actually a programmable choice. And we go into the menu system to find out what those choices are. We have 8 choices in total. We have LFO rate, filter resonance, filter spacing. So that's when you have the filter set to dual LFO stereo mode. Panorama. Panorama means basically the pan within the stereo field. Then we have VCO1 level, VCO2 level, VCO3 level, and noise level. So those are the 8 programmable modulation destinations that we can add to what we have on the dial itself. Right, finally let's take a look at our choices in terms of modulation shaping. That's adding a controller to our modulation bus signal routing. We have filter envelope, keyboard velocity, pressure, which is after touch, and we have a final option which is called on/program. Now the default choice there is on, which is no shaping at all, but it's actually a fixed voltage. So you can choose a fixed value, and that value can be anything from minus 2.5 volts through to plus 2.5 volts. So on means anything from positive through to negative. Now in terms of the other programmable choices, this is where things get rather mental because there are over 40 of them. To start off with, we have pitch bend wheel, mod wheel, velocity release, we have aftertouch, in other words pressure, we have keyboard CV, so that is tracking what note you're playing on the keyboard. We have touch surface, and there are 3 of the parameters for the touch surface. We have X and Y, and we also have something called A, which is actually area. So the touch surface is detecting how big an area you are touching, and you can get a control voltage from that. We have both of the mod 1 and mod 2 CV inputs, and then we have any of the available potentiometers that are on the front panel of your Voyager, and there are 32 of them. All 32 of those potentiometers can be used as a controller for your modulation routing. So let's sort of like take a random example. I could use the headphone volume control here as a way of controlling the amount of the modulation being performed by, say, my second modulation bus here, the pedal/on bus. So in this example I'm showing you now, I'm modulating the speed of the LFO, and by turning up or down the headphone socket control, I'm actually affecting the speed of the LFO. But the potential here is actually quite enormous. Rather than using something mundane like a headphone socket volume control, let's choose something else that actually affects the sound of the synth. Let's choose the cutoff control instead. I can get that cutoff control to affect the speed of my LFO in my modulation bus, but remember the cutoff control is still doing its regular job. It's still controlling the filter cutoff. So you can see here that we can have a control now with a dual purpose, controlling the cutoff of the filter and also affecting the speed of the LFO. And you can do that with any of the potentiometers on the front panel here. You can get them to do 2 things at the same time, control a modulation as well as doing their normal task. It can get really quite complex, and you can get some really fascinating results by using the front panel controls in this way. So what do you think so far? Not bad, eh, for a 20-year-old monosynth? But we're not finished quite yet. Now, as well as those two modulation buses that you see on the front panel of a Voyager, there are actually 4 more. They're programmable mod buses, and we access them from inside the menu system. Let's take a look. You can find these 4 additional modulation buses in the menu system, quite deep down there in the menu system, I have to say, and it's a menu option called Pot Mapping SD. SD meaning sources and destinations. Now, these modulation buses, these modulation routings, they're a lot simpler than the front panel buses. We have a source, we have a destination, but we don't have a controller. We have an amount to set the amount of the modulation, and we have a parameter called direction, which is basically specifying whether it's a positive or negative modulation. Now, the list of modulation sources and destinations are exactly the same, which makes things simple, but there are an awful lot of them. There's about 40 in total. Let's go through that list rather quickly. We've got some performance controls. First of all, we've got pitch bend, mod wheel, pressure, which is aftertouch. We've got velocity attack and release. We've got mod 1 CV input, mod 2 CV input, and we have key pitch. And then the next 32 are all front panel controls. We've got LFO rate, glide rate, mod wheel amount, pedal amount. For each oscillator, we've got the octave setting, the wave shape, frequency. We've got the levels in the mixer. We've got external audio level, oscillator 1 level, 2 level, 3 level, noise level. From the filter, we've got the cutoff, the spacing, the resonance. We've got the keyboard control amount. Then onto the filter envelope, we've got the attack, decay, sustain, release, and the envelope amount. And in terms of the amplitude envelope, we've got attack, decay, sustain, release. And we've also got the master volume and the headphone volume. So like the programmable shaping that we covered before, you can see there with those 32 different front panel dials, controls, you can use those to affect another aspect of the sound as well as the role that they're supposed to take on. So, you know, filter cutoff is for affecting the filter cutoff, but you can be using them as a source in these programmable modulation buses to control a completely separate modulation altogether. The weird thing for me is that it's exactly the same list of sources as destinations. So for example, if we go back to those performance controls, mod wheel, how can mod wheel be a modulation destination? Or how can the mod 1 CV input, and it is an input, how can that be a destination? Well, with those things, basically, what you're doing if you modulate them, if you set them as a destination, then you are controlling the amount that they are able to then provide a control voltage to modulate other things. Right, so let's try a little experiment to see if it helps us to understand these pot mappings a bit better. What I'm going to do is use this headphone volume control and use it to modulate the noise control. So that's the noise control. I haven't got any amount set on my mapping yet. So we're hearing the noise control, and the headphone control is not affecting the noise at all. Now let's just whack up the amount of my mapping here. Let's set the amount to say 50% to start off with. Let's see what happens. That's working, but not as fully as before. And you can hear there that when I turn it up to max, we're getting 50%. So if I turn the noise level to 50%, we now have 100%. So basically the headphone control is taken over the noise control by 50%. Now at 100%, the noise control has been taken over completely, and the headphone control is now 100% modulating the noise. Now let's take it one step further. Let's actually use that noise control to modulate something else. So I'm going to go into the second mapping. And here you'll see I've got the noise level, which is going to modulate the release of the amplitude envelope. So let's see what happens. I'm going to have to actually enable the envelope, and we're just going to also listen to one of the oscillators so we can hear what's going on. So at the moment, there's no mapping amount set, and the release is working as it should. Now let's turn it up to say 100%. Now the release control has been completely taken over. It's not doing anything anymore. However, the noise control is also not doing anything anymore because it's been taken over by the headphone control, which is now modulating both the noise level and the amplitude release. It's complicated to get your head around, I have to say. It's pretty amazing, actually. So I must admit, these programmable modulation buses, these pot mappings, as Bob Moog called them, they are a weird and wonderful beast. They don't behave like a normal modulation mapping at all. But then again, I guess we're dealing with controllers modulating other controllers. So taking control of those controllers makes kind of sense, I suppose. But I must admit, I've not seen this kind of functionality on any other synthesizer that I've ever played. So although they're very, very different to the mod buses, the traditional mod buses that we have on the front panel, there is a little bit of crossover between them. I mean, even though with these programmable mod buses, these pot mappings, you can't, for example, access the LFO or the oscillator outputs to use those as a modulation source. You can get all the parameters that change the sound. So you can get all the parameters, all the potentiometers that affect the sound of an oscillator, its octave range, its wave shape, frequency, etc. And you can also get at the LFO's rate as well. But there is some crossover because as modulation sources or destinations, we do have the Mod 1 and Mod 2 CV inputs, and we also have things like the mod wheel. So we can combine traditional mod buses with these pot mappings to come up with some very interesting results. In this example, I'm using the extended capabilities of the XL Voyager, which you could use with your Voyager if you have the VX351 expansion box. I'm basically taking the LFO of the Voyager, the triangle wave and the square wave from it, and I am pushing those signals back into Mod 1 and Mod 2. And then I'm able to access Mod 1 and Mod 2 from within the programmable Modbus section, the pot mapping section. So I've basically got three mappings that are utilizing those Mod 1 and Mod 2 CV inputs. The first mapping here is using Mod 2, which has got the triangle wave of the LFO plugged into it. I'm using that as the source to control the level of oscillator number 1. The second mapping is using that same triangle wave via the Mod 2 CV input to control the level of oscillator number 2. Now one of these is got a direction of normal, the other one's got a direction of inverse. So they kind of fit together in a out of phase kind of way. They sound like this. The third mapping is using the Mod 1 CV input, which has got the square wave from the LFO plugged into it. And what I'm doing with this is I'm using it to control the octave range of oscillator number 3. And by controlling the octave range, I'm actually controlling the pitch of oscillator number 3. So when we put those 3 different modulations together, each affecting different VCOs, we get a sort of a phasing, pulsating drone effect like this. So, we've covered so far the 2 modulation buses on the front panel, the 4 programmable modulation buses, the fact that we've got all of those front panel controls that we can use as a controller for the 2 front panel buses, and also as a source and a destination for the 4 programmable modulation buses. Are we finished yet? No, not quite. Now is the time to talk about the touch surface. Now the touch surface is yet another performance controller, a bit like a mod wheel or a pitch bend wheel, for example, and we've already seen it available as a controller for the 2 main modulation buses on the front panel. But using the menu system, you can also program the touch surface directly to modulate the synthesizer without going through any modulation bus at all. The touch surface actually generates 4 separate control voltages. We've got X and Y, which are the coordinates. We've also got A, which is the surface area that you're touching. And it also generates a gate signal lasting the duration of your touch. Those 4 control voltages can be assigned to a very large list of destinations. So the touch surface destinations are split into 2 groups. We've got one set of destinations for the X, Y, and A control voltages, and another list for the gate. So this is the list for the X, Y, and A. We have got LFO rate, glide rate, mod wheel, mod bus amount, pedal/on mod bus amount. Then for the oscillator number 1, we have octave and waveform. For oscillator number 2, we have frequency, octave and waveform. Same for oscillator 3, frequency, octave and waveform. Then from the mixer section, we have external audio input level. We've got oscillator 1, 2, and 3 levels. We've got noise level. Then from the filter, we've got the cutoff, the spacing, the resonance, and the keyboard control. For the filter envelope generator, we've got attack, decay, sustain, release, and we've got envelope amount. For the amplitude envelope generator, we've got attack, decay, sustain, release, and we also have master volume and key pitch. You'll notice that that list is really quite familiar, having gone through the programmable mod buses. It's an amazing list, and you can modulate any of those parameters with X, Y, and A from your touch surface. Here are the destinations for the touch surface gate. We have got no switch. Basically, it does nothing. Or it can modulate the glide switch, the release switch, the oscillator 1-2 sync switch, the oscillator 3-1 FM switch, the oscillator 3 keyboard control switch, the oscillator 3 frequency range switch, the external audio on-off switch, the oscillator on-off switch for oscillators number 1, 2, and 3, the noise on-off switch. So these are all from the mixer section. We've got the filter mode switch and the envelope gate switch. It's incredible, isn't it, that actually with the touch surface you can take control, temporary control, over all of the switches on the front panel of your Voyager. Now, if wiggling your finger around like that isn't your bag, if touch surfaces aren't really for you, and I do appreciate that because they're not really for me either, there's still something about the touch surface on the Voyager that you should bear in mind. It is basically your gateway to the wonderful world of MIDI automation. Now, for those eagle-eyed amongst you, when I showed you briefly the screen where you set your destination for your X, Y, A and gate for the touch surface, there is actually there mention of a MIDI control number. And that's where you can set a MIDI control number which will then allow you to automate your wiggling finger on the touchpad. You don't need to go anywhere near it at all with your finger. You can automate it all from a DAW, from a sequencer, or from some MIDI controller. And that's what I've got going on here. I've got just the X and the Y mapped, modulating. The X is modulating the pitch of oscillator number 2, and the Y is modulating the pitch of oscillator number 3. And then from my DAW, I'm playing some simple notes, which is obviously setting the pitch across all of the oscillators, but then I'm also automating those 2 CCs, giving offsets, if you like, that allow me to choose notes for oscillator number 2 and oscillator number 3 separately, and therefore I'm playing 3-note chords. I'm basically playing the Voyager with 3-note paraphony. So one final topic just to mention really with the whole modulation capabilities of the Voyager, and that is the different versions of Voyager that there are out there. The old school, let's talk about that first of all. It has no screen, it has no menu system, therefore it cannot possibly have any programmable options in terms of the front panel, modulation, shaping, sources and destinations. So there's no programmable options there. It does have the same CV connectivity as a regular Voyager, so you've got the Mod 1 and Mod 2 CV inputs. But what else is also missing with an old school, and it's the same with the rack mount edition, the RME, is that there is no touch panel with either of those two versions of the Voyager. So no touch panel functionality whatsoever. Fairly obvious, but I thought I'd better mention it. Right, conclusions time. I mean, I'm hoping that you can see from everything we've covered in this video how immense and deep the modulation capabilities of a regular Voyager are. They really are deep. And you know what? I mean, any Voyager is a semi-modular synthesizer. It's got CV connectivity and it is expandable, expandable. And we haven't even really covered that. All we've covered so far are just two control voltage inputs. It's an incredibly powerful synthesizer. But for me, I don't know how many people are really going to get on with this immense power that the Voyager has in terms of modulation, because I think that a large part of the appeal of a Voyager, it's similar to a Model D in as much as that front panel is designed so brilliantly. It's so simple and straightforward and intuitive and immediate. You just sit down in front of a Voyager or a Model D and you just know what to do. It's the layout is just so familiar to us. And that kind of goes against the whole modulation capabilities. They are really deep and you have to go into the menus. I really do think if you want to harness the full power, the modulation power of a Voyager, then you have to kind of leave those modulation buses alone. Well, not leave them alone, but you have to sort of like go into the menu system. That's where the power really is. All of those potential shaping controllers, destinations and sources are there inside that menu system. And to be honest with you, when I'm interacting with my Voyager, the biggest reminder to me that I'm dealing with a 20-year-old synthesizer, or not my particular model, but you know what I mean, is actually when I'm dealing with the menu system. The menu system is clunky, it's old, it's giving away the age of the Voyager, that menu system. And to be honest with you, it's down to the screen and the resolution of the screen and how much information can be put on that little screen. Modern synthesizers with their high definition screens are just so much more easy to deal with. You can get, all of that modulation information on one page. You can see a whole modulation matrix. You've got none of that with the Voyager. It's page after page after page after page. It's not a deep menu system. There's not that many levels to it, but there's a lot of information to get through. You've got these little buttons to play with. There's no sort of like rotary encoder to quickly jump down to where you want to go to. It is a dated interface, let's face it, and that's what you're going to have to deal with to get the full power out of the Voyager. For me personally, I'm going to have to dig out a little bit of a cliche at this point. and that is I'm just scratching the surface. To be honest with you, after the months that I've had my Excel, I really am just scratching the surface in terms of the modulation capabilities of it. What I'm tending to do more than the modulations themselves is actually look at how I can interface the Voyager to the outside world. I've got it there in front of my Eurorack gear for a very good reason. That's because I'm seeing how I can link it up and integrate it with Eurorack gear, and that's working very, very well, and I'll do a video about that in the future. But those modulation capabilities, you know, without any Eurorack, without any modular whatsoever, there's just a lifetime of discovery going on inside that Voyager with all of those modulation capabilities. I'd really like to know what you think. If you are an owner of a Voyager, how well are you getting on with those modulation capabilities? How much of what I've shown in this video are you actually really using on a day-to-day basis? It'd be interesting to know that. It's really, it's an eye-opener for me, this Voyager. I really never dreamt that it was so deep than it actually is, and it's only since I bought one and started to play around with it that I've really discovered for myself what an amazing instrument it is. So that's all I've got time for in this video. I hope it's been interesting to you, useful to you. Until the next one, as always, thank you very, very much for watching.